We know that 1 in 6 children is sexually abused, and one of the greatest weapons that we have against that to empower young people with the literacy and skills to be able to recognise and name abuse is using accurate terminology for their genitalia.
Jo Morgan is an author and sex educator specialising in teen relationships.
What the evidence shows is that young people who have quality sex education, both from at home and at school, actually are more likely to delay first-time sex, and when they have it, they're more likely to be safer around it.
I'm Lorraine Candy, best-selling parenting author and mum of 4 children, and I know the questions which keep parents up at night. In this series, I'm going to be taking the panic out of parenting by getting practical advice from experts on how to navigate the complex journey of raising teens. In this episode, we're talking about teenage relationships and why you need to talk to your children about sex from day one.
So my relationship with porn started at a very, very young age. In fact, I was about 4 years old.
We're leaving young people without the skills and tools that they need in order to equip themselves for adult lives.
A recent survey found about a third of young people have used harmful behaviours in a relationship.
1 in 7 women will be raped or sexually assaulted at university.
So what can parents do to help? You spend a large chunk of your day talking to teenagers about sex and sexuality. How was your sex education and what did you learn? Because you went to a Catholic school, didn't you?
I did, yes. Most of my sex education was taught by a nun, and it wasn't great, to be honest with you. I was incredibly lucky that my family had always spoken really openly about sex. And so for me, the experience in that classroom actually was quite funny. The nun was incredibly awkward. She was trying desperately to really promote a very singular vision of sex and marriage. But unfortunately, there was a darker side to it for some of my peers. It was quite homophobic, I would say, in its tone. It was really engendering quite a sense of shame as well around sex, and particularly women's bodies and sexuality. And when I later became a teacher and got responsibility for sex education, I was surprised to see that the curriculum hadn't really moved on. Although I wasn't teaching in a Catholic school, it was still incredibly heteronormative, phallocentric, so really just focused on male sexual pleasure. And it hadn't gone beyond that at all. You know, I don't think the young people experiencing that sex ed would have come away feeling empowered or really knowing what great sex can look like and be. And so I kind of set about overhauling the entire thing.
Well, it's only been mandatory to teach sex education for 4 years, hasn't it, in this country?
Yes, it was 2020 that the statutory content came into force. Prior to that, most schools felt that they were sort of duty bound to do something, but it was incredibly patchy. So the statutory provision...
Well, it still is patchy, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
We don't know who's getting what or being told what, really, unless we're involved in it as parents.
Yeah, it was a great move to make it statutory, there's no doubt, but it's still, there's a huge amount of work to do.
One of the questions I get asked a lot is, when do I start talking to my children and teenagers about sex? How specific do I have to be? Do I have to be an expert in masturbation, consent, contraception? I'm a former editor of Cosmo, so I always thought, well, I'm very open about sex, it's fine. But I've talked to other parents who can't quite believe how open I am, saying that I'm encouraging all sorts of behaviour that might not be welcome. It's a minefield for parents.
All of the studies that have been done, and the Sex Ed Forum's an amazing organisation which does a lot of research into this, it always finds that young people want their parents to be talking about it, and they want more at school. They want to be learning about this, diving into the topic. And so whilst there's no specific age at which we should be having cut-offs, I would say, about when we can or can't talk about things to young people, what I would say is beginning as early as possible in an age and stage appropriate manner, which creates a culture in the home of openness and curiosity rather than embarrassment, awkwardness or shame. If we start that day one and then build upon that, the individual child will lead it themselves. They'll be bringing up things, they'll be asking questions. If we ask them questions, they're far more likely to be open about what they're looking at, thinking about, talking about. And so an overarching philosophy towards this, I would say, is better than trying to create specific age cutoffs.
So you're really talking about, when you say day one, what do you mean?
Half of 12-year-olds have been exposed to online pornography. And so what we need to be doing is having these discussions before they're being exposed to the content.
Before school, do you think?
Well, I would certainly say that having conversations about bodies and consent and boundaries and privacy is really important
And
from
using
day
the right
one.
language, because I hear a lot of nicknames and things being bandied around. That's not good, is it, for kids?
No, euphemisms are not useful. We know that 1 in 6 children is sexually abused, and one of the greatest weapons that we have against that, to empower young people with the literacy and skills to be able to recognise and name abuse, is using accurate terminology for their genitalia, you know, vulva, penis, anus, and so on. And we know that some court cases involving sex abuse have fallen down because children haven't had that literacy.
Yeah.
So talking to them about their bodies from day one, using accurate terms, not having any taboo or shame around it, is the beginning of those building blocks to positive, curious conversations.
And you can use things, cultural things, as jumping off points, can't you? You can use things they're seeing on the telly or something they've seen in a book, can't you, from a very young age right the way through?
Yeah, and that's so much better than sort of just having this birds and bees chat that you suddenly
mafia sit down.
Yeah, that you suddenly come to and the parents are anxious and everyone's feeling awkward and embarrassed. Rather than that, using any opportunity, when things come up on TV or whatever it might be.
And
nature absolutely,
programs.
to talk about it so that it's not a taboo. And you know, giving them that skill of sexual literacy means that they're going to grow up and continue to develop and acquire that skill as they become teenagers and adults. You know, they're going to be much more likely to be able to go and buy condoms when they need to, go to a sexual health clinic, speak to you about a problem if it occurs, negotiate consent with a partner. You know, all of these incredibly important life skills, you will be setting the foundations for that.
And let's clear up another myth. If you talk to them about sex, sexuality and their body parts, it doesn't make them have more sex, does it?
Absolutely not. In fact, what the evidence shows is that young people who have quality sex education, both from at home and at school, actually are more likely to delay first-time sex. And when they have it, they're more likely to be safer around it. They're also more likely to be able to navigate consent effectively, report problems as and when they occur. And I know that parents are worried about it. I know that there's quite a lot of sort of moral panic around this. But let's look at the evidence and let's look at the alternative. You know, if we don't have these conversations, where are our children going to be having them?
Yeah. So say you haven't had those conversations in depth as a family. It's not the culture of the family. You might have issues around sharing that kind of information yourself. In the teenage years, it is particularly important, perhaps from sort of 13 onwards. How do you start? How do you abandon the awkwardness? I mean, I always say to people, watch Sex Education. That teleprogram was so helpful for so many parents, I think, because you're in a state of disbelief that your children may not be doing this. And actually, a lot of children are. We just don't know about it.
Wherever it is, side-by-side chatting is really effective to avoid some of that sort of awkward horror, embarrassment. But as you said earlier, you know, using some of those cues from a TV show. So, for example, Normal People is the first sex scene between the two main characters. The way that they negotiate consent between them, I felt, was a really authentic depiction. They're laughing, they're talking about contraception. It's very clearly a real enthusiastic yes from both of them. So perhaps using things like that, or Heartstopper is another great show, using that as a springboard for conversation. But also you may have friends who are better placed to do this, perhaps a godparent. I often get my friends saying to me, please, can you talk to our kids? And very happy to do that. So I think don't just avoid it, find solutions, and perhaps ask yourself and be curious with yourself, why am I finding this so difficult? Many of us have inherited scripts around sex from our parents and our education, which actually have given us some issues around it. And I think maybe just curiously reflecting with ourselves whether there's an opportunity here perhaps to do better next time round.
Now, you're in schools, you talk to teenagers and preteens all the time about what's going on. What are the challenges for them around sex and relationships? Can we talk a little bit about body image? Because I hear this from my daughters. There's a way that women are expected to be. There's a passiveness that's sometimes expected, and all of that kind of feeling around what they look like and that perfectionism around them as well. How do we talk to our teenagers about that?
Yeah, I mean, the problems for teenagers are in many ways the same that we had, feelings of being insecure. How do I look? Am I performing well? All of those things are the same. But of course, they are the internet generation and the social media generation. And the added impact of that is pretty phenomenal, I would say. Then we add in pornography, which of course is nothing new, but the age at which young people are exposed, that, potentially pressure from a future partner about mimicking acts that they've seen on porn. It's a lot. And so I think the best thing that we can do as parents and as society is really enable them to navigate this space. We can't completely protect them as much as we might want to.
So we're listening to them when they're worried about things, aren't we?
Yeah.
And not dismissing their fears about their shape or their size or the amount of hair they have on their body. For example.
And it can be difficult, again, because we've got our own scripts and our own values to just, dismiss it and say, that's ridiculous. Of course you shouldn't be doing this, or you shouldn't worry about that. But actually what we need to do is really be curious with what they're feeling, they're experiencing. And I think sort of legitimize what they are feeling in that space, because they're being subjected to a lot of pressure. And if we can listen, help them to be curious, help them to acquire critical thinking skills around this and a real sense of their own agency and empowerment, then they're far better placed to be able to deal with it.
I think that's very important, the critical thinking skills, because you can ask them to question what they're seeing, can't you? Are there particular leading questions that provoke a conversation that you find work with teenagers?
I think for me, a lot of what we're missing at the moment is the positive stories around sex and relationships.
Pleasure and desire.
Yeah. So quite often I think we're very preoccupied with what can go wrong. And that's understandable, and it's important to talk about that. What is rape? What's going wrong in terms of social media? What does a damaging relationship look like, and so on. But I think what we also need to really focus on and help young people to explore safely with us is, what does the positive alternative look like?
Yeah.
What is sexual pleasure? What is empowered sex? How do we get this right? What's a healthy relationship like? What's the first time that you have sex with someone like? And so on. And help them to really kind of tap into a sense of being active in that space rather than passively allowing things to happen to them, which I think they're more likely to do if their self-esteem is suffering, if they're unable to counter some of the narratives that they're being exposed to.
So would you talk to them sort of in the early teens around orgasms, masturbation, sex toys, that kind of thing?
Absolutely.
You would use all those phrases, and that would be a good thing to do.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, what we want to do is build up to it slowly. So again,
not over breakfast.
No.
Out of the blue.
Yeah,
How
again,
did your exam go?
Yeah, if we're just suddenly coming out with a chat about sex toys, there's going to be a bit of a awkwardness around that.
Absolutely, yes.
But what I would say is during a preteen and teenagers time with you, as you are having conversations about, what I think, even just general questions like, why do people have sex, do you think? Asking that when you're talking to your teenager, why do you think people do? And then exploring some of the reasons. And then when they sort of come up with pleasure, talking about that, how do you think men and women experience pleasure? Have you talked about that at school? what do you know about the vulva and the clitoris and so on? And could you draw it, and sitting down at the table together and drawing it and talking about the fact that actually a lot of women won't have an orgasm from penis in vagina penetration. How do they then have an orgasm? Let's talk about that. It's really different for different people. Some people like to use sex toys. And so just over time, working your way through that, normalizing those discussions. And again, I think if we do that, we empower young people to get sexual consent right. I think quite often, we're keen to talk about consent and help them to get it right, but we're not talking about what good sex is. And so if young people, particularly young women, aren't going into their sex lives thinking it should feel good, knowing what they deserve, knowing how their bodies work, and their partners as well not going into it like that, then it creates a real barrier, I think, to sexual fulfillment, and it makes it more likely that they'll get consent wrong or begin their sex lives doing things which hurt and don't feel good.
And I think with boys as well, having talked to some teenage boys about this, one of the big things for boys is worrying about whether their body and parts of their body are normal. And they don't really discuss that with each other. How do you reassure your child that everyone's genitalia is completely different, so there is no normal? I
think literally talking to them about it, or even showing them. I will literally sit down with my kids and show them what I would show in the classroom. So, I've got a penis gallery, I've got a vulva gallery, and we'd look at them, and it's funny. We'll laugh. Well,
that's the other thing I was going to say. Humour is really underestimated in this conversation. I think some of the best conversations I've had with my 4 teenagers is when it's been funny about
Absolutely. And sex is funny. When I started as a sex ed teacher, one of the classroom rules for sex education was no laughing. And I immediately tore that up because I thought I've had tears of laughter pouring down my face.
What's the funniest question any teenagers ever asked you in a
honestly,
sex lesson?
there are so many asking about, farting and fanny farts and things like that will always lead to absolute hilarity amongst all students. And just the whole thing, when we can create that culture where we laugh together, and showing them, as I say, looking at the genitalia galleries and saying to them, look, some are much bigger, some are smaller. When it comes to penises, some, when they become erect, grow much more than others don't. And just talking about it, and if we don't, the chances are then that all they've seen are their own genitals and perhaps what they've seen in porn, which is often very kind of extreme, very large penises or whatever it is. And so to help them build that sense of perspective and self-esteem, let's help them understand what's usual or normal.
Can we talk about consent? Because I think that's probably takes up a huge chunk of sex education lessons now. And I think, again, as you've said, it's patchy how it's taught and what we gain from it. I think there's also a difficult time for boys at the moment with this toxic misogyny, or as you've called it, actually aspirational misogyny that is happening. How do we talk to our teenagers about consent from a gender point of view? How do I talk to my son? How do I talk to my daughter?
So there are some messages which are universal for all genders. So I'll start with that first. And then I think a gendered approach is really important as well. So the universal messages that I want to be getting across are what empowered sexual consent looks like. So first of all, from that very early age, we want to be talking about bodies, boundaries, privacy. Touching, how, that you can come and talk to me if anyone asks you to do anything or says anything and so on. And then as they become teenagers, we want to be talking about empowered sexual consent. So the way that I talk about that is it has 2 main features. Both people are active and they're willing. So to be active, they're doing things, they're saying things, they're touching themselves, they're touching each other, they're talking to each other, they're both actively doing things, and they're willing, they want it. I often use the phrase hell yes, they're both really into what is happening. And of course, if they're very drunk, then that willingness then becomes under question. So we would want to be really kind of unpacking that with them. So both people are actively, willingly participating in the sex act, whatever that might be, from the beginning and all the way throughout to the end. And that can be withdrawn at any moment. And I also then talk about the feedback loop of consent. So what you want to be doing is checking in with yourself. Is this what I want? Do I feel good? Is it giving me pleasure? Do I feel like I could say no if I wanted to or change my mind? And then you're checking in with your partner with the same kind of questions. And when you've got that feedback loop coming back and you're both feeling empowered, that's what great sex is all about. Right. And you want to wake up the next day and think, that was great, let's do it again. Not, oh no, what have I done? Am I going to be accused of something? Did I get this wrong? Or, you know, anything kind of negative, really. So that's how I describe sexual consent. When it comes to a gendered approach, I do adopt quite different lenses here. And I think it's really important for us to do that. I'm going to make some real generalizations here. From a girl's perspective, I think there is a huge amount of pressure, and we know this from the evidence, to mimic the behaviour of porn stars, to act in ways which essentially are about the male gaze rather than their own sexual pleasure. And again, this is why we've got to be empowering girls with information about their own pleasure and bodies. So we're seeing, for example, a big increase in girls being treated for injuries to their anuses. And that's because, you know, a large majority of pornography features anal sex. It's become normalised in the eyes of teenagers. Yeah. It's often seen by some as the kind of new virginity. Right. And so whilst for some people that is a healthy and enjoyable part of sex life, it is not for most people what they do in day-to-day sex. Yeah. And so helping them, again, with the critical thinking skills, tapping into their own sexual pleasure so that whatever they are doing is what they want to be doing and it feels good and they're able to really kind of tap into their power. So for girls, that's something I really want to focus on.
So teaching them that it's okay to say no.
It's okay to say no, but also I think it's bigger than that. It's about self-reflecting their own power, their own agency. Not just saying no, but saying yes. What do I want to say yes to? And understanding the no against the backdrop of that, you know? So I think that's really, really important. And what I find when I go round to schools, when I talk about female sexual pleasure, a lot of teachers and actually a lot of parents find that really quite difficult.
Well, it isn't talked about much, is it?
No.
It's almost a rarity.
Yeah, and we have our own, you know, socialisation that we've been through. My pushback against that is that schools, and indeed often parents, if they do talk about sex, are talking about sexual pleasure. It's just that they're only talking about male sexual pleasure. The male ejaculate, erections, wet dreams, all of those things don't seem taboo to people. And so I think we've got to really unpack that ourselves and do better.
But with boys, are we making them, obviously I've got girls and boys, are we making them feel bad? Are we saying that all boys want to have anal sex and can't hear the word no? Are we saying, is that a kind of subconscious or implicit message they might be taking on board because their neurology is developing, they don't know who they are, they're struggling to talk about emotions, they're feeling under pressure themselves. How do we talk to boys perhaps so they don't feel alienated as part of this discussion or guilty that the conversation is mostly around male sexual pleasure?
Yeah, so this is a really important question and it is an incredibly vital piece of work. If we don't get this right, the sexual violence problems that we have currently, which are
escalating
through the roof, are only going to get worse. You know, when we have a generation of people exposed to pornography and things in a way that older generations weren't, I genuinely fear for the way that's going to go. So what we've got to do...
There is a survey, actually, that I was looking at that boys who watch violent porn during their teenage years are 3 times more likely to engage in violent sexual behaviour. That's a survey that was out last year. So actually the conversation with boys is almost more important, isn't it, in many ways, at this point in history?
It is. We also know from the report by the Children's Commissioner just over a year ago that 35% of young adults had intentionally sought out violent porn.
Right.
It has been normalised.
So how do we make it great for our boys? How do we make them feel happy and joyous about sex as well? Because they do like it.
Yeah. So again, we've got to adopt a positive and empowering approach for them. We've got to help them to go into their sex lives feeling excited and knowing that they know how to get this right. When I work with young men and boys in schools, actually, that's what they're saying to me. They want to get this right. They're looking forward to it. But quite often the messages that they're getting are making them feel like victims. They feel like victims of a society which has prioritised girls over boys in their view. They are getting a constant stream of very misogynistic content online, which is telling them that boys have been left behind, they've been forgotten, that they are going to be falsely accused of raping people, and that, they're being told, or they're being given the impression that they are being blamed for the sins of other men, essentially. And so what we've got to do with young men is meet them where they are. We've got to be curious. We've got to listen to what they're saying.
Non-judgmental. Yeah,
we've got to reassure them, but we've also got to help them to do better. We've got to help them to work out what great sex looks like for them and their future partners. We've got to help them to tap into women's sexual pleasure if they're heterosexual, but understanding that the pleasure and agency of their partner is just as important to them as theirs, and the gains that can be had from having sex, which is very different from sex in porn, So we've got to help them to really understand from an early age, ideally before they're watching it, that sex in porn is a fantasy and extreme version of sex.
Yeah, so you can use that word pornography with children under 10, can't you, and explain? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think making that word taboo would be unhelpful. I think we need to help young people to understand what's out there. And of course, the role of parents in terms of putting restrictions on phones and internet access and so on
in rooms
is really important. But we all know that even with all of those things in place, your child can walk into school or go onto the bus.
Someone else's phone.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we need to be having these conversations and empowering them to be able to understand things which are potentially really disturbing and really dangerous.
So if your teenage son has watched porn or violent porn, and we know they're going to find it somehow or be shown it, I think we can safely assume most teenage boys have. What do you do in terms of talking to them about it? Do you say, have you watched violent porn, young man? Where do you start?
So I think what we want to do is...
And I'm not saying girls don't watch it. I'm just saying it's more prevalent among boys, we believe, according to statistics.
Yeah, it is. But I think, for any gender, I think what we want to do is depersonalise it a bit. So rather than asking them what they're doing or watching, speak in more general terms. Right. And that's both at home and in the classroom. And I would be asking them to think about, and then I would be supporting them to think about, what are some of the potential issues? Not demonising porn and saying that it's evil or wrong. We want to avoid engendering any sense of kind of shame or blame or fear. Rather, what we want to do is be entering it in a sense of curiosity. Lots of people are really worried about young people watching porn. What are your thoughts? What might be problematic about it? See what they come up with and then bring in other things that they haven't. So, for example, that a lot of porn is made by men for a male audience, but has been taken to an extreme. So a lot of the ways that women's bodies are treated actually wouldn't be pleasurable. They would be very painful, often very degrading.
Yeah. So critical thinking. Can I ask about nude pictures? So I read a really brilliant piece of advice the other day, because I know a lot of teenage girls feel pressured, but a lot of teenage girls want to send nude pictures. And the advice was, don't put any identifying features in it if you're going to say that. Is there any other advice that you could give parents whose children may be sending nude pictures to each other? Because there have been some really terrible cases of children taking their own lives after thinking these nudes are out and about on the internet.
I think the first thing, probably the most important thing, is to avoid catastrophizing it. Right. I was speaking to a dad recently who had said to his daughter, I can't protect you anymore. And I think I understand why he said that, but actually I would argue he needed to say the opposite. I'm still here. It's going to be okay. We're going to find a way through this. So many young people are sharing nudes. For my generation and others, it can feel so shocking. You know, if that had happened...
It does feel normal now.
Yeah. And you know, I think I was growing up without smartphones. If a nude had gone round when I was at school, it would have been unbelievable. And whilst it has been normalised for the younger generation, actually they remain as judgmental as we were, you know.
About what they're seeing, what they're sharing.
Particularly when it's girls. You know, there is so much shaming and double standards around these things. What we need to do, ideally, with our children is help to prevent them from doing anything which is going to lead to problems, but also helping them to firefight any problems if they do occur. To your point about not including faces in images, that is incredibly important. So I would never say to a young person, don't do this, don't do that, because it's not an effective strategy with teenagers.
So the opposite happens.
Yeah, but what I would be helping them to understand is the immense risks associated with a nude image with your face in it. And with the advances in facial recognition
and
technology. It is absolutely everywhere. Now, maybe because of deep fake, because you know, anyone can make an image of anyone that's not real, maybe we might get to a stage where this all sort of actually becomes a bit diffused by that.
Evaporates slightly.
Yeah, but we're not there yet. And so, talking to your children, understanding that they're curious, that there's going to be temptations, but really getting them to think about, in each moment where they're faced with a potential risk, how can they tap into an empowered approach, which makes them actually reflect on their behaviour and think, I'm glad I did what I did, not, oh no.
Thank you, Jo.